You need to find your voice to be able to be honest and be accepted and respected for what you believe in. Even if you don't agree with it, have a conversation about it.
While things are becoming more and more complicated and there are more and more factors coming into play, and but all the while that's happening, people are kind of becoming more and more fixated, and like it's kind of becoming more and more extreme. And while the middle ground is increasing, people are kind of deserting the middle ground.
This poetry was written to hopefully open up, as I wrote in my introduction, to open up other people's echoes and discover their own echoes and their own vulnerabilities.
Looking at the underlying problem, which isn't necessarily like I don't feel safe sharing my views, because a lot of people who have extreme views are perfectly fine sharing their views,
Right.
right? It's all over social media, and that's kind of like they've built their identity on that, and that's part of the problem. Is also, as people become more isolated, they lack a sense of identity. They attach their identity to these views, and so for people, it's not like having a safe place to share that. It's that trying to be open-minded in any way will undermine a whole lot of things.
First, we have to accept ourselves as being mortal and imperfect people. If we have more tolerance of ourselves, then we have more tolerance of other people.
In 2019, Dr.Donald Cohen began to write a series of poems that became his latest book, Echoes of COVID. His poems took on a new meaning during the pandemic, a period that tested us in our ability to find community without physical contact. He dedicated his book to the heart and soul of humanity, a global community that today is suffering from a war in Ukraine, broken supply chains, and rampant inflation. In the United States, we are also suffering from growing political polarization and growing evidence that young people are suffering disproportionately from growing rates of depression, self-harm, and violence in our schools. While reading Dr. Don's poems, I could not help but feel that his perspective echoes far beyond the pandemic. Thank you for speaking with me today.
Happy to be here with you.
There's just so much that I want to cover. I've really enjoyed reading through a lot of the poems coming from Echoes of COVID. One of which is the poem War. And on January 6th, the day of the attack on the Capitol, you wrote the poem War, which was clearly a reflection on the attack. How do you think your perspective might be different from most adults looking at the same event?
I mean, it's hard to think that any adult or kid could see it differently from what I wrote about in that poem, because it was unprecedented, something one would have never envisioned to happen in our country. I don't think there's, in my opinion, any other way to see it other than complete chaos and America dysfunction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And how had like writing out the poem help you interpret these extreme events, and including the attack on the Capitol and so many others that occurred during the pandemic?
Well, I think you can see in this poem was different than all the other poems in the book because it was almost a rapping rant, cathartic moment for me to just express my internal passion and anger and pain over what happened, which poetry does. Poetry is an outlet for expressing what's inside. And I think for me, it was, you can see from the language that I use in it that I was kind of reliving the experience and having my own catharsis in expressing it in the words that I used, and to try to tell the story and mix that in with my own editorial perspective.
Yeah, yeah. I think that is something that I've kind of seen through your book, and your poetry is kind of a new way of exploring these things, and expressing emotions and thoughts and concepts in a way that, like, for me it was a little bit new, since I haven't necessarily like done a whole lot of poetry or read a whole lot of poetry. But I think it is kind of like a definitely more of like an abstract, but then in that way it's also kind of it allows you to see things from a different perspective when it's laid out in a different format. Um, and towards the end of your book, there is the section with all of the can be's. So, what is a can be in your own words, and what are you hoping people learn from this concept?
Before I do that, if it's okay, I think what I want to do is just go back a second and tell you that I think the poetry in this book was different than my others,
Uh
which
huh.
address the can be's as well, in the sense that I see this as different because it's documenting a specific time in our lifetime that's really a global event as well as an American event.
Mm-hmm.
So this poetry book, which makes it different, is I was really, it's pretty chronological, and it's pretty much like a documentary of me wanting to document literally my journey, how I got through these last 2 years. And
Mm-hmm.
can be's a little bit like a canto of Dante, so to speak. Cantos Dante is my own observation about how paradoxical this period of time is and how we live in so much paradox. And then Grayson, who you know, who's my grandson, he saw that I was going to call the can be's paradoxes, and he said, "No, Poppy, these are bigger than paradoxes. These are can be's." And I said, "What's the difference in a can be and a paradox?" He says, "Can be's mean that they can just extend into all kinds of possibilities. You're less limited." But basically, my philosophy can be's is that two things can be happening at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Two things that can be completely opposing to each other, whether they're ironic, contradictory, paradoxical, juxtaposed in any way, showing that basically you can have, uh, for instance, sadness can be enlightenment. You can experience one thing that seems completely opposite than the other, and yet they make sense as it can be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And also touching on what you said earlier and kind of just like almost your journey in living through all of these things. And that is something that when you look through, when you learn about history, and this is like a big moment in history, that's one thing that we have so much more of today than back then, which is just like just raw I guess experiences or the perceptions of how people were looking at these historic events, and especially in a way where it is your thoughts on everything that's happened during the pandemic and all of these things that that occurred, and just really like your, I guess, your understanding of it in real time as it's happening.
Yeah, I actually think the poetry book, and we call the can be's, if you know, it's the second part. I almost felt this could have been two different poetry books, but I felt the can be's were so much part of the COVID experience that I felt it should be. I called it the glossary of our time.
Mm-hmm.
So when you finish the poems, there's a second section that's titled The Glossary of Our Time. I truly believe that this book and these can be's really exacerbate that or amplify it,
Mm-hmm.
will be something that we will reflect on for years as a documentation of what it has been like to live in the world we live in today. Because it really, it expresses to me, as I said, a glossary of our time, that all the things that I write about, some of them are factual, by the way, in the can be's, but even in the facts, for instance, um, the fact is Donald Trump can be a Nobel Prize winner. I mean, that's a fact, but it's also, you could really imagine the irony in that. Uh, the fact that a time like this can bring darkness, can be lightness, the Taoist philosophy of showing how the opposites can play with each other. And through doing that, you're also giving facts in history, but you're also stretching the mind to think in possibilities and can be's, and learn to not see things, as we've talked about, as black and white, either or, but and or. I call it the and language. It's not just one or the other. So the can be's, and you see it in the poetry too that I write about. I write a lot in terms of Taoist philosophy of seeing good and evil and how they play on each other and how the opposites and how the goal in life is to try to find oneness in the opposites.
Yeah.
And that we don't have to think rigidly. We can think broadly that things can be, they can be all kinds of things, but we don't be, nobody, as we've said, nobody has conversations. You can't think in a can-be language unless you have dialogue and are willing to see both sides of the coin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also recognizing how important like the opposites and the things that contradict each other give whatever it is like even more meaning, like they're and just like understanding um how if everything was dark or if everything was light, then that would cease to have any meaning. Um so one thing in the poem No Man's Land, you start off with the line, the in between we have never seen. And there's also, but and within the poem, there's also a lot of expression about uncertainty. At least like my interpretation of the poem was that there is a lot of uncertainty and questions. And the no man's land is where we cannot explore and talk about the nuances of our world. And so when you said the in between we have never seen, did you mean we are blind to this? Is it ignored? Are we afraid to see it or something else?
No man's land to me is that we live in a very, we're not defined right now. It's a simple example, although it's a complex issue, is, do I wear a mask? Don't I wear a mask? Do I get vaccinated? Do I not get vaccinated? Do I hang out with this one or that one? What's the right or wrong thing to do? Nothing's clear cut. It's very ambiguous. We never lived in a time that I can think of that's more not defined and so in between and so uncertain and so unknown as to what's right and what's wrong.
Mm.
So no man's land is exactly what it says. We are not sure where we're going, where we are, and perhaps not only where we've been. And so we're really, it's a time when we're living a lot of ambiguity.
Yeah. What do you think kind of made you want to express that, and also thinking about like the other implications of as we are increasingly living in a world where things are becoming more and more complex, then therefore um, then you can just like be less and less certain about the future and even where we are now. What are the other implications of that?
Again, we've talked about this. I think one of the ways we deal with living in a world like this is to have conversations and allow people to express their different points of view. And so if we don't see all sides of things right now and being open to finding some middle ground between the extremes, we're going to just never go anywhere. So I think right now, that's the can-be language. It's the poetry of the echoes of COVID, is to learn about actually not only not just learn from people who think the way we think, that's always comfortable for us, but to really try to think about things that other people are saying that aren't the way we think,
Yeah.
the can-bes, so we can have that dialectic and that conversation to problem solve and find some in between that makes sense that we can be comfortable with. But right now, the biggest problem we have is black and white, not and or.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to learn how to understand what makes people see things differently than what we see them.
Yeah.
And we really, we see that in the poem Handcuffed, for instance, with the gun control thing. We talked about it's not mental health versus gun control rules. It's all of the above. But unless we create a new environment from the day our children are born in the household, you can do whatever you want with guns, you're going to have mental health problems.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, it's not about it's not about just background checks versus mental health. It's all one. It all matters.
It's almost contradictory how it's kind of like as thing while things are becoming more and more complicated and there are more and more factors coming into play, and with technology and just everything going on. And but but all the while that's happening, people are kind of becoming more and more fixated, and like it's kind of becoming more and more extreme. And while the middle ground is increasing, people are kind of deserting the middle ground. So
Yeah, well, I think that's part of the problem with no man's land, because no man's land creates fear.
mhm,
And when you're afraid, you want to hang on to a certainty. And the certainty for these people seems to be in the extremes. People are not comfortable living in ambiguity. And that's where we live now. And that's part of life. That's the can be language. Learning how to live in the middle is learning how to live in ambiguity and not think in an either or kind of way.
mhm, yeah. And also, one thing is that you started writing Echoes of COVID during 2019. So how did like the purpose of your poems change from when you first started writing them in 2019 to when the pandemic hit?
Yeah, I found it kind of curious that the first poem of the book is called Frozen Time. And I had some physical problems during that time when I wrote it. Of course, we had no idea that COVID was about to occur, but I had Bell's palsy, which the left side of my face was literally frozen. My eye was paralyzed. I didn't want to call the poem my Bell's palsy because it was really more metaphorical to think that when you are in a paralysis of your facial muscle, as a matter of fact, Justin Bieber is going through that now, but it's not called Bell's palsy. He has something else. But you go inside and you feel all the things I wrote about in that poem, and it was like having a plague. So in the first poem, which was in 2019, I was writing about my own personal plague, which was my physical illness. And then as the poetry went on, we had lice in our house. And that was another poem I wrote and got metaphorical about, again, the paradox of love and lice. I call the poem Love and Lice because uh, it was in my nest, it was in my community where the lice manifestation took place. But within that time, we were very communal and very loving. So therefore, we called it uh, love versus vice, or love and vice, I think is what I called it, because even through vice can be love. And then at the end, which is a very powerful poem, is the poem Ghost Town, which was also written at the end of 2019. Who knew at that point, when I was writing Ghost Town, how many of us have experienced being ghosted by people? Where people, I wrote a poem earlier in my career called Satellites Unseen. This is the more advanced version of Satellites Unseen, when there are people that you know who are not physically dead, who've just disappeared out of your life and you don't know why. And boy, who knew that in 2019, we were all going to start experiencing a form of ghost town when our relationships changed. We weren't able to see people, people disappeared. But in 2019, when I wrote it, it was just because I was already feeling this disconnect and feeling that I'd been ghosted by people and not knowing what had happened to them. And I was already feeling the alienation. So when COVID broke out in 2020, I said to myself, maybe it's important to have the 2019 poems in there as well, because in a sense, it just goes to show in the poetic world or in the journey of just that we all take within ourselves, it's all one. So I was already experiencing things in my inner life that was starting to occur in my outer life. And then, of course, when COVID hit, you really had a very specific plague that took over all of us. So basically, 2019 was a series of internal discoveries that became even more amplified in 2020 and 2021, and probably one could say are still going on in 2022.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, definitely. And one thing I was also kind of thinking about as you were talking about more of like the backstory towards some of these poems, is just like with poetry, things are a lot more vague when you're communicating them rather than um just stating what was going on, because a lot of these I didn't really make the connection. I was kind of um interpreting it in a way that made sense given like my experiences and just like how I interpreted it. So it was really interesting kind of hearing about more of like the backstories and how it actually came about. Um, so
That's true, actually, and they both have value.
yeah,
I want you
yeah.
to have your own experience, but having the backstory can create interesting conversations for people to have with each other, because perhaps my backstory is different than yours, or maybe you say, wow, I can relate to that. That's some of my own personal story too, and we can talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um,
Backstories are good though. There's backstories, but sometimes even when you're writing poetry, Sumay, you don't really know exactly what the backstory is. There's a trigger for the backstory, but then the words just flow out, and then you want people who read it, such as yourself. My 7-year-old is now reading it, which is amazing. My granddaughter, to have their own experience of it. But then I love the idea of being able to talk about it with other people.
mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's also all of this is kind of interconnected, and also earlier talking about just like having conversations, and then also I think that there's also been like a lack of vulnerability in people's willingness to be able to feel vulnerable, and that's almost like then and with your book that's like it's just like very vulnerable to just share your experiences and all of these things that happen to you. And I think that that's also something that people need to see in order to feel like they're able to be vulnerable, is if someone else takes the first step, then it's a lot easier to then think, oh, then I can kind of open up and not feel like I have to pretend to be somebody else, or
You
hide
got
what I'm actually feeling.
That's my dream. You got it, Sumay. That's my dream. Is this poetry was written to hopefully open up, as I wrote in my introduction, to open up other people's echoes and
Mhm.
discover their own echoes and their own vulnerabilities, and to feel like, wow, like that makes me feel such and such. And maybe I can find out that I wasn't the only one that felt that way, because we all went down into our inside world during this time. And I think that people need to start talking about that, writing about it. They're starting to write about it and starting to see movies about it. You'll see more books about it. But
And understanding how different people's experiences were as well, because that's one thing that, because we were all so isolated, um someone someone might think, oh, the pandemic was really terrible for me, and then other people might think this opened up a lot of opportunities. Like for our family, we were kind of a little bit different than everybody else, where we were
right,
just having a blast and doing a whole lot of things with each other. And for us, it was a lot of fun. Like obviously there were some hard things that came with the pandemic, but for a lot of people it was a lot of different types of experiences, just because if you're so isolated, it's kind of like we're all in our little bubble of it, of knowing only just like what we've been experiencing, or who you're talking to and what they're experiencing. But it's still so kind of fragmented based off of what's going on in your life, and then just kind of exacerbated because everyone's just like in their own house. um, but
there you go. Two different experience, two different feelings about the same thing.
mhm.
We will call that the silver lining, right? I mean, or the can be language again, or the paradoxes or contradictions that, like, during a time of COVID, that's how Weekville was founded, right? Weekville was founded right during the thing you're now doing with your school. If there were no COVID, you wouldn't be homeschooling and doing Weekville, right?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was. It just enabled so much of like opportunities to, basically the main thing was time and being able to just be with our family and do these things. So it did enable a lot of that for us.
Well, we need to broaden our scope, right? Stretch our souls, stretch our visions, stretch everything out to feel like, we don't have to be so confined. If we just stay in a rigid perspective, then we can't grow. So I like what you did. I like that you have taken this period of time of tremendous loss and despair to turn it also into something that's growth producing and enlightening.
Mhm.
One does not negate the other. They learn to work together.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's something that I've also noticed is because a lot of people were they were suffering because they weren't able to go to school, so then they were switching to virtual school, and there's a period of time that there was kind of like an in between, and a lot of people were like, we don't know what to do with our education. That also opened up a lot of opportunities, and so it's almost kind of like a can be in itself, where while people are while there are a lot of problems going on, that's when all the opportunities show up, because that's when you're able to find solutions for those problems.
There you go, back to no man's land and the in between, right?
Mhm.
A lot of creativity and a lot of transformation can occur in the in between.
Yeah.
I think we're going to see a lot of, we're already seeing a lot of change, creativity, and growth that come out of this. And, but, a lot of darkness and a lot of pain. But we have to have a wider vision if we're going to keep going on. It's sort of Sisyphus in Greek mythology. I don't know if you're familiar with Sisyphus, but Sisyphus kept having to push the rock up the mountain. It's kind of Sisyphean in Greek mythology, where Sisyphus just kept going and going and going and trying to just kind of create and transform and learn and grow. But everybody's so afraid. Everybody's putting themselves in their separate boxes now. And man, it'd be nice if people could just talk about poetry and have these kind of good discussions, because at least maybe we would feel less isolated and perhaps even inspired. Uh, that's what we want to do with We Voices, right? We want to have conversations with kids, adults, maybe together,
Yeah.
uh,
Mhm.
get different points of view.
And build a community where you can really like be vulnerable, and that's something that I really liked about your book. One other question I had was, in the poem Without or With, you wrote, with full acceptance I live, and I wanted to know like what you meant when you said full acceptance. Did you mean like acceptance of yourself, acceptance from others?
Well, like we talked about when we talked about the gun violence, and I talk about in the poem Handcuffed.
Mm-hmm.
Imitating love is a lot better than imitating hatred. So, I think that first we have to accept ourselves as being mortal and imperfect people. If we have more tolerance of ourselves, then we have more tolerance of other people. That is part of the problem with the gun violence that we talked about in our last interview. So, first, acceptance from within means self love. Self love is created by what you're exposed to, particularly early on in your house, and to be surrounded by people who also accept you and value and make you feel like you matter. The more you love yourself, the more you have self acceptance, you can accept other people for their flaws. Um, Even the people that I talk about in Ghost Town, I don't talk about anybody specific in Ghost Town, but when you're ghosted by somebody, your first reaction is to take it personally and feel victimized and feel unaccepted within yourself and find that what they're doing is unacceptable. But then you have to say to yourself, and I think the poem actually addresses that, is to try to understand perhaps what the other person is going through. As I said, where so many people operate out of fear. So sometimes when we think we're being ghosted, it's because we're mad at them or we think that we've done something wrong, but maybe they're not facing something then themselves. And so if you have that attitude of more tolerance, then you can be more accepting. And then if you were more accepting, you would not be imitating hatred. You'd be imitating love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's also something that is like feeling acceptance, when there's also like all these other things going on, and there's like isolation, and there's kind of like, if you're not seeing people on a regular basis, then it's kind of almost like, unless you're taking initiative or other people are taking initiative, then essentially everyone's ghosted you. It kind of feels like that. Because it is kind of like you had to make a switch from just seeing these people every day, and you had no choice. But like, I mean, if they wanted to ghost you, then they would be like actively ignoring you. It would be more of a chore to try to ghost somebody. But then when the pandemic hit, then it's like, oh, either I take the initiative and reach out to them, or they take the initiative and reach out to me, or just it it just unintentional ghosting. It's a
Well,
lot.
like, that's where I think being vulnerable is useful, because sometimes when you're ghosted, you really can't, you don't even know what to do about it. But
Mhm.
instead of being angry, you can say, I miss them. And if I miss them, I would love to have a conversation and try to understand what happened, because maybe what I think has happened isn't what happened at all, but you don't really know until you've really gotten the clarification, rather than making the assumption that somehow you're the victim of somebody's meanness. I mean, people are really not doing very well.
Mhm.
Apparently, I heard from some woman yesterday, a mother in her 40s, that every kid in this town is on medication. So, now is a time to be very empathetic. And if you're feeling ghosted, uh, maybe they're feeling ghosted too.
Mhm.
So, therefore, if we're all having a little bit of being in a ghost town because we've been so isolated, you want to get out there. You
Yeah.
get out there. This is CBS morning show, by the way. There's some kid, by the way, I was very impressed. He's going out in the streets right now and interviewing young kids in Brooklyn, just getting kids in the streets of Brooklyn to talk. We did Kids Are Talking originally. We were out in the streets. I mean, you just got to start talking to people, and be interested, and reach out, and be
And also,
vulnerable.
if you do feel ghosted by somebody, that also is an indication that you actually care about them. Because if you didn't care about somebody and they just ghosted you, then you wouldn't feel anything. You wouldn't care. And
I
so,
always feel bad when I'm ghosted. Doesn't I don't know how you feel. I'm sure you've been ghosted. It never feels good to be ghosted.
yeah.
I'm
But
so
but
good.
also understanding that like the more like pain you might feel from being ghosted or rejected by somebody is more of an indication that you really valued your relationship with them and you had a lot of really good memories. And so that's kind of a pathway to just feel more forgiving, because a lot of people did struggle. And I think that also opened my eyes through your book, is that um I I've just had a very different experience than most people during the pandemic, because of everything we were doing, and because of just like all the opportunities and things that we were able to do. Like these have honestly felt like some of the best years of my life because of everything that we've done, and that was just very, very different for many people.
I love that you're reaching out, doing so many good things, Sumay. That you're a true gift to the world, the young people and the older people as well. And yeah, I think that uh, we all have to face the facts that we want to be loved, we want to feel connected, and when we admit or don't admit, we have to we all care. So if we're pretending we don't care, then that doesn't go to good places. But if we pretend we really do care, yes, if you feel someone's out of your life and you don't know why, I miss them. And then I have to do one or two things. I can either ghost them back, or I can reach out to them, which is what the poem is about, and try to have a conversation and see how they are. And maybe it's not about me. And if it is about me, well, let's talk about it.
Hmm.
It doesn't have to be like a fight or an argument, called conflict resolution in my business, but it's like you either sit back, and there are certain relationships I feel really badly about, and some I've accepted as really that we can't go anywhere because I've tried to talk to them and there was just no accountability. That's the problem. You try. There are certain times when you try, and if the people you try to talk to and they can't be honest and vulnerable and have accountability, then you are limited as to what you can do in those kind of relationships. But you try.
Mm-hmm.
And if you
Also
fail,
knowing that like how like when people do hurt you in some way with a relationship, and kind of understanding that a lot of the time they don't even know sometimes, like if you feel ghosted or rejected, and people can't read your mind, they can't see how you're interpreting all of the things that they're doing to you. And that's some especially in like elementary school. When I was in elementary school, I felt like if someone would hurt me in some way, I would feel so much like how could they do this to me? And 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 that was one thing that I needed to realize, was that oftentimes they had no idea that I was feeling a certain way. And especially if you aren't in a good place yourself, you're not actively looking to other people to see like how they're struggling and how they're feeling based off of your actions. And so and a lot of people, they had a lot more things that they needed to deal with during the pandemic, whether that's like all of a sudden your kids are at home instead of school and you have to figure out what to do. Or some people, they're working from home, and then you have to there's just so many
empathy.
complications, right?
You need to have empathy, because get in the shoes of other people. That goes back to the conversation about that kid in Texas, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Kid in Texas. Remember we talked about in our last interview about people not paying attention?
Yeah.
There were so many signs. You notice how nobody's talking about that kid in Texas. I mean, we're talking about, obviously, there's nothing good about AR-15s being in the hands of 18-year-old kids. There's nothing good about not having background checks. But how about the fact that nobody paid attention to this kid who was really, really obviously not feeling very good about himself and not doing very well? No one's talking about that kid, but I don't understand. Now we're going to get into my other poem, which is, we're handcuffed by the fact that we don't really, there's a pattern of these people. We talked about this in our last year. There's a pattern of these kids. They're not kids that feel good about themselves, and they're kids that have basically communicated in so many ways that they're not well. And yet we don't pay attention, and we don't really look at all the mental institutions that have been shut down. I mean, look at all the mental health professionals. You can't even get an appointment with a therapist. They're so overloaded. You got every kid in a suburban town on medication. There's not enough places for people to go to get help. How about the schools? Get more help in the schools.
And I think part of it is like making is it being more of like a weighted choice in terms of like reaching out to other people and feeling empathy, is that as we become more and more polarized and extreme, then it's kind of seeing people as just humans who have flaws that are just like you, kind of undermine some of your beliefs in terms of just like seeing like, oh, how could these people do this, or kind of blaming and pointing fingers, and thinking, oh, this person is horrible, or this group of people who think these certain things are bad people because of what they think. And so just the underlying assumption that you have to make in order to just like feel empathy for everybody around you will undermine a lot of you, like what you think. If I mean, if as you're getting more polarized and extreme in your beliefs in those ways. So it is kind of like there are more things that have to change in order for people to just start reaching out and becoming more empathetic, because there are a lot of like interconnected issues where it's like you don't want to make it so that everybody become empathetic, when becoming empathetic undermines these other things that will just like, then there's an existential crisis of not knowing what your identity is. And that's another thing, is that sometimes when you're isolated, it's a lot harder to know who you are, because when you're interacting with other people on a regular basis, and you kind of attribute a lot of who you are with like how they perceive you, and how your friends would say you act and who you are. And and it kind of gives you a more concrete understanding of that. Whereas if it's just like if you're just isolated in your house and you're just there, like, it's so many things can happen. And I think that there's a lot of that we're seeing a lot of those changes. But yeah,
How do you help? So how would you help people feel less isolated?
I mean, I think that is a hard one, because since a lot of these communities have like um have eroded away during the pandemic, there's a lot, then you kind of have to build it all from the ground up, right? And making all those new connections. And then also a lot of people losing relationships, and people change in 2 years, especially if they're all isolated, and people can change a lot if they're just like in their homes and you don't know what's going on. And so then if you've lost those relationships, it won't necessarily just all come back together after the pandemic and you just reach back out to those people and remake those communities. If a lot of things have changed, a lot of people have changed in a lot of different ways because of that. So I think that part of it is that um it's also harder if when people have become more extreme in their views, because then they'll be less open to like trying to build a community um with people that might have opposing views. So
Why
uh,
not? Why not create an environment where you have people with opposing views have more conversations? That's what we want to do. That's what we wanted to do on Kids Are Talking. That's what we want to do with We Voices. We don't want everybody with the same opinion. Uh, we want a conference. As a matter of fact, I know of a conference that's going to be held in a couple of weeks where the person who set up the conference is deliberately having uh, some extreme Republicans and probably extreme Democrats and probably people in between. And they're all going to be under one roof on a mountaintop for 3 days. So don't you think we ought to create more situations?
yeah, I think that part of the problem is you can't try to like put these people on a mountaintop, and try to get them to have open conversations. But if they're not willing, and if people are in those situations, they won't want to put themselves in a position where they are speaking to people that are opposed to their views. So it's kind of like people will just use their free will and choose not to.
Well, if you make it attractive, then don't you think you have to make it attractive to them to think that they can go there and maybe perhaps not be ghosted, that the person who's running that conference, who's leading it, is going to conduct a safe environment for the people who are resisting going, to kind of prepare them for the fact that there's going to be a place where they can uh, share their point of view and be heard.
Well, I think it's part of the I mean, we've talked about this a lot, but just on also looking at the underlying problem, which isn't necessarily like I don't feel safe sharing my views, because a lot of people who have extreme views are perfectly fine sharing their views,
Right.
right? It's all over social media, and that's kind of like they've built their identity on that. And that's part of the problem, is also as people become more isolated, they lack a sense of identity. They attach their identity to these views. And so for people, it's not like having a safe place to share that. It's that trying to be open minded in any way will undermine a whole lot of things, not just your views, but who you think of yourself, right? And how you and so then that'll have a lot more implications that are much deeper than just, oh, this person disagrees with me. It's
That's
undermining myself and like
Su-
who I am and my self-value.
Sumay. This is our purpose. This is our job. And as a therapist who's been running groups for 43 years, a good leader, a good moderator creates a dialogue. That is the whole purpose of We Voices. Kids are talking. A good conference allows different points of view without letting that person get destroyed for having it. It's really the job of good leadership, in my opinion, and the responsibility of good leadership to create that. And I believe if we're going to move forward together, working and discussing subjects that I think are going to be perhaps controversial or differences of opinions, I think it's our job, and I feel comfortable doing that with you, to help people feel that it's an okay thing to do and teach that.
Yeah, that's one thing that we heard from one of the people we were talking to who they're doing homeschooling now, but they had a really negative experience at the school that they were previously going to, where they would sometimes like there would be political discussions that came between the kids in the class.
Exactly.
And in order to put it down, the teacher would take a side and say, this is right,
Exactly.
and then tell the other kid
That's
like, you can't, this is right, and then just shut down the argument. And it's like, it's almost like we can't say that we don't know. And it's like, and then also, and that's also like the lesson that you're teaching with that is that like that this person is just the arbiter of truth in these issues, that there is no objective truth. Like that's the reason why we have these different points of view, is so we can try
yeah,
to maintain a balance.
you go.
And because both sides of the argument are
Yeah,
really important in
that-
these really important and like thorny subjects,
that's
is
right.
that if one person just takes control
That's,
and implements everything that they think, it's going to be catastrophic. Same with the other person. But if it's constant kind of like a balance, maintaining through conversations, through compromises, and through continuing to disagree, um, that's how you really strike the balance. And that just can't happen if if, if there are no conversations and there's nobody saying, I don't know.
that's the can be language you're talking about. And like a great show, a friend of mine was suggesting we do a show on ethics. How interesting would be to create 10 or 15 ethical situations and have a bunch of kids on and see how they agree or disagree on those particular ethical situations. And one of the can be's on the first page, a can be is that Donald Trump can be president. He became president. He's still powerful. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. Whether you like it or not, it happened in our country. The question is to discuss why that happened and why it could happen again. And don't be afraid and angry about it. Try to understand the thinking behind that. Even the gun thing, by the way, the Republicans, look, I really have a horrible time with the whole gun situation. But the NRA certainly doesn't. So if they're the ones that are controlling the situation, then we have to have talks with them. I want to understand what they're thinking. When I meet somebody, I'm not a Donald Trump fan, by the way, but if I meet somebody that likes Donald Trump, the first reaction other people have is, "Oh, I don't want to know them. I don't want to talk to them. If they're the NRA, I don't want to talk to them." Well, if you don't talk to them, we're going nowhere. We're going nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
So if we want to stay isolated in our bubble and be angry and think that we're right and they're wrong, it's not going to matter, because if you can't try to understand the two different sides and find some middle place to go, we are doomed.
Yeah.
We
And I
are
think that's also another thing relating to what I was saying earlier about like vulnerability, is that that requires a lot of vulnerability. So I think a lot of the just expressing yourself in a way where, being able to listen to other people and what what they have to say is being vulnerable, because you're saying like I'm open to you being able to, it's basically saying I'm letting you influence my opinions, right? Because if you're saying, oh, I like letting, just like hearing other people's point of view, if you're not letting that influence your decisions, you're not listening to them, you're not really letting them share their point of view. So by doing that, you are being vulnerable, and you are kind of giving up that just like control that, oh, I'm gonna always believe this and you don't know what you're talking about. And so I do think that that is something really important in your book, even if it isn't directly communicated, but just the fact that you can just share the things that you're thinking, and not just, oh, people are gonna shut me down, they're gonna just stop listening or stop caring what I have to say, but just being open and vulnerable in that way.
Yeah, I mean, my poetry is my own echoes of what lives inside of me. It's my way of expressing it. Um, there are no rules. I don't write from a place of rules. I write from a place of free thinking and free expression. I want other people to hear my poetry and maybe inspire them to write their own poetry. Or if they're poets are accused, by the way, often of, oh, I don't know what they're talking. There are a lot of poems I don't understand what they're talking about either. But I try to make my poems accessible. And if you want to know what I'm trying to talk about, do what you're doing and ask me what I'm trying to talk about. And maybe you want to start writing poetry. And there is no set rule about the kind of poetry you have to write, because there is all kinds of my poetry is like, I was just told recently that my poetry was defined as the spoken word, which there's all kinds of different poetries. Mine is the spoken word because I just come from my heart and I just let it out there, like the beat poets did in the 60s. But some people follow more rules and formalities as poets. We do what's our comfort zone. But if anything, it's a way of sharing our vulnerability. It's another way of, it's like an artist, a painting or a drawing. It's like, it's a way, any way you can get people to express their vulnerability and their depths of where they are, and having it be shared and other people to share it with them. I mean, to me, the goal, one of my dreams is to be in an artistic community of poets, all kinds of artists who are just bearing their souls and doing it through their own personal point of view. I'd love to do some shows on that too, with other writers. There are a lot of kids writing really beautiful things. As a matter of fact, this weekend I'm planning on my 7-year-old and my two granddaughters. Hopefully we'll start talking about my poetry, and maybe they'll write their own poems with me, or they'll write them separately, and we'll start getting to know each other that way. It's another way of connecting and having honest conversation through the vehicle of the arts. That's what I'm going to do on my July 4th weekend. Have you fun to have you there, Sumay, because then you could join in too. We could have our own show up in Rhinebeck, New York. We could bring all your equal people with us, so we could have a conference just focused on that. A place to just express what everybody holds inside with each other. I mean, my idea when I wrote these poems and write my poetry books, it clearly is for myself when I do it, but then I want to share it. Even if you don't like it, I want to know what you didn't like, or what you did like, or what made you uncomfortable, what it make you think about. Imagine if we did it, we certainly don't do that enough in the schools, right?
Also knowing that you don't understand yourself, right? That's something that people think is, oh, of course I know me, right? That's almost seems silly, but really when you start diving deeper into just the very decisions and actions that you make in every day, and really trying to understand what is your motivation, who are you, and that's one thing, that's why I got really obsessed about like personality types, Myers-Briggs, but more broader than that, just understanding like natural tendencies and how we really just don't even know who we are on our own. And that is something that's like, we don't want to think that, because that causes us to, there's causes us to admit that we don't know, right?
Well, yeah, Myers-Briggs, by the way, it's impressive that someone your age knows about Myers-Briggs. Just for people who don't know what Myers-Briggs is, one of the things it was based on Carl Jung's typology of the human personality. But
Yeah.
let's just take introversion and extroversion.
Mm-hmm.
An introvert always has trouble understanding an extrovert. An extrovert always has trouble understanding an introvert. So the can be would be to learn more about how an introvert thinks if you're an extrovert, and for an extrovert, for the introvert to understand the extrovert, and the extrovert to understand the introvert. And probably somewhere in between, because my doctoral dissertation, I came up with a typology called ambiverts. Some people are both. Some people are ambidextrous with their right and left hand. In the Myers-Briggs thing, by the way, the Myers-Briggs, you notice there's no measure of the middle there. You can have certain typologies. One of my problems with the testing batteries, although they're
Actually, I
useful.
think the Myers-Briggs test, when you do take it, it
Mhm.
shows you percentages for them. So it'll show you like you're 60% introverted or
That's
something
cool.
based off of
Oh, that's great.
so yeah, I think that was something that I think was really eye-opening to me, because that's like almost like, there, it's one thing to have like to think that about like something other than yourself, like your views on certain decisions or something, and then but to just realize the fact that nobody fully knows themselves. There's so many things that you do that you don't even know why you do it, that is just traits about who you are, um before you realize it, when you realize it, you're just like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting, that's something about myself that I didn't even know. And so just kind of understanding that, and that there's a lot of humility that comes with that. um
Humility.
but
Yes,
then
humility.
that also is like, if I don't even know myself, then that's kind of, it has to extend to everything else, because that's like the first thing you should know, right, is yourself.
Yeah, and we should be, well, we should be, I think you're saying we should be open to the fact that we can learn from other people, right?
Yeah.
We might be, like you say, have humility
Mhm.
is to not feel like we have to be defensive if somebody has a different point of view, even about us, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is something that's like well, during the pandemic, every time someone joined the school, the first thing we would have them do is write an about me project or a know thyself project. It was either
Mhm.
one of those, where they would kind of explore themselves either by taking a personality test. Some people, they don't really like personality tests, so it was more just like kind of an introspection. The thing I liked the most about personality tests was kind of the terminology and the introducing you to concepts that you might have not
Mhm.
previously like kind of known about in terms of thinking about people, right?
Yeah, it helps categorize. You talk about the Myers-Briggs test in particular.
Yeah, that was the main one that we really like, and then also Principles U, uh, which has a lot more like traits and like things that they use. It's a lot more detailed. Uh, but yeah.
That's just, I guess what you're saying, and that's true about, I mean, I did my doctoral dissertation on typology. It does help us by forming these traits or these categories. It kind of reinforces what we were talking about. It's another tool to help us understand why certain people think the way they think, right?
Yeah.
And it gives you some kind of structure for that. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's mostly kind of just like, well, it's useful for a lot of things. One, understanding other people's differences, kind of the humility that comes with recognizing that you don't really know yourself,
Mhm.
and then also kind of seeing, um, yeah, there's a lot of things that come with kind of just understanding yourself more. I forget what this how this first came up. But yeah, I have found it really, really interesting. I think that is something that is really important, is being able to also having an interest in other people, because a lot of the time before, that's another thing about these personality tests, is then you realize like, oh, other people don't get, like, if you're an introvert, other people don't get drained when they're around other people. They actually get energized when they're around other people. And it's like, you didn't even know that about other people, because your first assumption is going to be that the way that your brain works is the same way that other people's do. And
Right.
that's another thing that just like relates to everything else that we've been talking about, is also developing a curiosity in other people, right? And trying to, and seeing the value in learning about, and just like building relationships. That's one thing that like is I think, as we've become more isolated, then people kind of, their the value that they see in building relationships becomes um like dwindles a little bit.
What you're really talking about is being open-minded,
Mhm.
free thinking, open-mindedness, right?
Yeah.
Again, the purpose of the can be language in the glossary of our time in Echoes of COVID is it's almost like teaching another language, having people look beyond to be more open to different ways of viewing things. And that's what Grayson was talking about can be versus paradox. It's one thing to say that something's paradoxical, but stretch your mind and try to really rethink different things, rethink the opposites, things that seem opposite maybe aren't so opposite. Maybe an introvert and extrovert, although they seem opposite, right? Uh, maybe there are some things about an introvert that are uh, that are not what we think they are, and same for an extrovert. There can be paradoxes. I know some very introverted people that are very maybe more authentic than the extroverted person and can connect with me more because they're coming from such a deep place within themselves. Where an extrovert, sometimes people accuse extroverts for being insincere and too outer oriented. And so it's not a better or worse or a more or less. It's an understanding that each thing that we are, whether you're introvert or extrovert or a feeling person, a sensation person, whatever the category or trait might be, that we learn from other people's differences and find out that maybe we're not as different as we think we are once we learn that.
Yeah.
Cheers to the typology tests, as long as they're not rigid and too black and white, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that we also like in Weequal school, we always wanted it to be more of like a group exercise, so it wasn't just like, oh, go take this test all by yourself and don't talk to anybody about it, but like send it to all the people that know you best and think like, oh, does this make sense? And then also the real, on, it's funny, on Myers-Briggs they have a article about like why kids shouldn't take our test, and it's like, oh, they'll think that it's super rigid and that they can't change, and it's like, that's not the case if you're having conversations and you're talking about like how people can change and people do change, especially when you're younger. But
Actually, Carl Jung, who basically the whole Myers-Briggs thing is based on what Carl Jung, who was a very famous psychiatrist.
yeah.
The goal in life, as you say, is to know thyself and to integrate your opposites, and that if anything, I would see that with these typology tests, these tests we're talking about, is that develop the part of yourself that's not developed.
Hmm.
And maybe the best way to develop the part of yourself that's not developed is to be with somebody who really has that part developed.
Yeah, it's really funny, since our family, we're all in the four corners of opposites. I'm the opposite of my sister, my dad's the opposite of my mom, and we're kind of, I share 2 letters with my dad and 2 letters with my mom, so it's kind of like a balance there that's a little bit coincidental. But
It's cool. And you all talk about it. You talk about that together.
yeah, I mean, that is something that it's a struggle, at the same time that it's really enlightening to just um everyone is like so different from each other, that there's also, it requires you to be a lot more flexible in your thinking,
And
in order
accepting.
to build these relationships. Yeah, yeah, and accepting, and knowing that like, just like I'm like tend to be a lot more organized, and then for the people that are less organized, then you kind of have to like find a balance, and then and that also requires you not to just like be accepting in order to find a balance, because both people have to accommodate. So
That's basically what we're talking about, right?
mhm.
And that's what the echoes of COVID is about, is uh, making you think in terms of poetry can be useful if we explore it as not an ism of absolutes, but a place to just tune into how it makes you feel. I think it's great for kids to write, by the way, and adults too. When people write, some of the
Definitely.
best poetry right now, for me, was just keeping a journal of my feelings. Write down things that have just come to your mind, and before you know it, you might be writing a poem and you don't even realize you're writing that poem.
Hmm.
And it's just good to create and express and let your mind be free to think in terms of and or, not either ors, and be a protean thinker. A protean thinker in Greek mythology, Proteus was a Greek god. Every time you thought you knew who Proteus was, he would change his form. He was a flexibility. I always think of Protean thinking as flexible thinking. Greek mythology is kind of cool that way. I don't know how much you've read about Greek mythology, but there's some great lessons in Greek mythology about learning what these gods represent in terms of basic ideas and principles that we can integrate into self-understanding. So that could be a whole other talk. So,
Hmm. Yeah. Well, just a couple things that I did want to mention before we wrap this up
sure.
is we're creating a series of videos with Dr. Don reading his poems, and so you can subscribe to get notifications for these upcoming videos. And the last thing is we invite any young people with an interest in the topics that we discuss to come on We Voices and share their voice. The information for that is in the description. We have a We Voices room on wecool.app where you can meet us and talk about the show. So yeah.
We got all kinds of things that we're thinking about doing for the fall, right, Sumay? I mean, there are so many things to explore and talk about, and
Yeah,
look
definitely.
forward to us doing some of that together, um, bringing in all kinds of ideas of conversation. I thank you for this. Always good to talk to you and have conversation. And I'd always like to give you the last word.
Well, I mean, I really enjoyed reading through all your poems and of course our conversation. But yeah, just looking forward to what we do next, and looking forward to hearing from any of our listeners, just your thoughts, and definitely check out the Echoes of COVID.
I love
Um,
that cover. Thank you. Love that cover. Just so you know, my granddaughter, who's 7 years old, discovered that that's a silhouette of her on the cover of the book.
mm,
And she is now cuddling it and reading it, and showing that no matter how old you are, you can strike a poetic uh, spark inside yourself. It's not limited to being any age. So never be afraid of poetry. And don't worry if you understand it or not. You don't really have to understand it. Just experience words, play with words, just enjoy language, and find your own language to express what you want to express and share it with other people. That's all I have to say.
I really like that. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad you like it. I like you to like. I think we like a lot of what we say to each other and what we think. So that's why we're together now, you and I. That's what makes this fun for me. So I'll see you soon.
Yeah,
I'll see you
sounds good.
soon, and we'll decide where we're going together. Okay.
Sounds great. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, and have a wonderful afternoon, and enjoy that beautiful family of yours and all the people that you're helping at Weekful, and just keep growing. And
Thank you.
COVID has created something positive for you, for other people. Good for you. All
Thank
right.
you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.